Hello, my name is Kimberly Doe, and today I will be exploring and discussing the history, politics, economics, and culture of the Afro-Asian diaspora in the Philippines. The Philippines is located in Southeast Asia and is made up of approximately 7,500 islands, making it the largest archipelago in the world. As of today, the Philippines is home to more than 110 million people, all of which reside in more than 7,000 islands. With such an enormous population, there is also a lot of diversity within the culture. A large percentage of Filipino culture is heavily influenced by Chinese, Spanish, American, and Austronesian civilizations. The Philippines is widely known for many other things as well, including its abundance of beautiful beaches, delicious fruits, and idyllic escapes for locals and tourists. But behind the modern-day picturesque sights of the Philippines, there are post-colonial mentalities that are still present within many communities and have influenced the way local Filipinos perceive the marginalized indigenous Negrito Filipinos. The term Negrito was coined by the 16th century Spanish missionaries who were operating in the Philippines. Later on, this term was borrowed by other European colonists and travelers to label those who had dark skin and relatively small physical stature. The label Negrito essentially bundled various peoples of different ethnicities together based on the characteristics described by the Spanish. However, the appropriateness of this label has been criticized and challenged as it fails to recognize the distinctive features of each ethnic group. In response to these critiques, the term Afro-Asian was created and deemed to be more appropriate and modernized when describing Black people with Asian ancestry. The first emergence of Afro-Asians appeared in Southeast Asia approximately 70,000 to 20,000 years ago. Many anthropologists believe that the Philippine Negritos were descendants from the first settlers of Southeast Asia, and later merged with other ethnic groups from neighboring countries such as Egypt and India. Centuries later, the presence of Afro-Asians became more noticeable as they were settling in different parts of the world and repopulating. Shortly after World War II, the Afro-Asian population quickly multiplied by millions. As of today, Afro-Asians consist of 0.01% of the total population in the Philippines. The hostility towards Afro-Asians in the Philippines is deeply rooted in the past wars with the Spanish and Americans. Years after the Spanish government ratified a peace treaty in February 1899 and turned the Philippines over to the United States, many Filipino resistance fighters still had strong resentment and opposition towards both the Spanish and American military forces. A couple months after the U.S. established its presence in the Philippines, a war quickly broke out, which involved both white and black soldiers from other regimes previously stationed in Cuba. Although many black soldiers were fighting side by side with their white counterparts, they were still experiencing a great deal of segregation and racism. In turn, the soldiers began to develop social ties with Filipino communities that were located in the towns and villages they occupied. Although many of the soldiers had one-sided sexual relations with Filipino women, several others maintained close relationships with the women, even ending up marrying those women, and remained in the Philippines after the war to take care of their families. This ultimately generated a huge influx of Filipino babies mixed with white and black blood after the Filipino-American War. The diverse ethnic and racial backgrounds in the Philippines influenced friendly relations between blacks and Filipinos because many of the black soldiers viewed Filipinos as light-skinned blacks or mulatto people. In reference to Stuart Hall, although African Americans and Filipinos are not the same, their cultural identities and ancestry do reflect common historical experiences, shared cultural codes, and eventually a common diasporic identity. This close relationship influenced Filipinos to welcome the idea of black migration into the Philippines in hopes of rebuilding their communities that were severely damaged by the war. The Philippines eventually became home to history's largest percentage of black soldiers who refused to go home after their military services while being provided more socioeconomic opportunities than they would receive in the U.S. As a result, black migrants began to pour into all parts of Southeast Asia and the Middle East, with a large percentage residing in India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines. As the population of Afro-Asians continued to grow throughout Southeast Asia, so did the economic opportunities and trading relations. The 2-millennia-old Afro-Asian trading route between sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East paved the way for socioeconomic growth that has greatly increased the economies of these countries. Valuable products and raw materials from this ancient trade route included ivory, silk, gold, spices, and African slaves. African slaves were essential players that helped maintain and advance the economic development of primeval China and East Africa. By the 13th century, many African slaves were able to achieve influential positions in society and became freed, or would arrive to other countries as freed men. The transportation and circulation of valuable goods and people continued the growth of the Afro-Asian diaspora, while simultaneously allowing the historic Afro-Asian trading system to continue to dominate international markets. While the prominent territories of Southeast Asia were flourishing socially and economically, the more isolated indigenous communities, especially the Negrito population, were virtually unaware of the changes but still suffered the damaging effects of the changing society. In my research, I found that there are about 25 different ethno-linguistic groups of the Negrito population, one of them called the Aita Negritos. The Aita Negritos of the Philippines are just one of many foraging tribal groups that suffered human rights violations, along with the rapid decline in their population due to high mortality rates, deforestation, settlement by outsiders, changes in their ecosystem, land grabbing, disease, and murder. The Aita peoples had very little to no political voice when it came to defending themselves from land conflict with non-Aita farmers and government officials in Manila. Fortunately, political decisions were made and two government-designated land reserves were established in 1934 and 1939 to secure and preserve the ancestral land, history, and culture of the Aita people. In 1984, 8 Aita family heads formed and signed a constitution that helped them secure their land rights and prevent any outsiders from intruding. This political movement of land and human rights prompted more indigenous groups to stand up for themselves, including the Kayapo Indians in Brazil and the Inuit Eskimos in the Northwest Territories. However, the Aita tribe experienced an enormous amount of cultural trauma and dramatic loss of identity and meaning because of how much of their members and ancestral lands were destroyed in the name of modernization and politics. While the Aita people and other indigenous Filipino tribes might learn to survive in an ever-changing world, their traditions, hunting styles, and way of life may be lost. Just like how the Spanish occupation Hispaniola consequentially created racial hostility between Haitians and Dominicans, it is the same consequence for Filipinos and Afro-Filipinos. Afro-Filipinos are often marginalized and discriminated against because of the darker skin complexion and unique physical characteristics they possess that do not fit with the traditional beauty standards established by Spanish and European colonizers. Today, it is very common for Filipino women to purchase skin products that contain bleach in order to achieve a lighter skin color and feel more accepted. This essentially taught Filipinos to value Western culture while devaluing their own. Despite being taunted and discriminated against, Afro-Filipinos have embraced their differences and taught their members that their skin color is a gift from their ancestors, not a curse. The cultural and physical differences have created a visible disconnect between local Filipinos and Afro-Filipinos, which has forced Afro-Filipinos to isolate themselves and create their own communities for their hybrid identities. The history and culture of Afro-Asians are often overlooked and rarely acknowledged by government officials, politicians, and local people, but that doesn't mean they should be forgotten. 2 questions I have for future research is, how will the Philippines be affected by the gradual loss of its oldest indigenous tribes? Will Afro-Filipinos remember their ancestral roots if these tribes do become extinct? For future research purposes, I hope that there will be more analysis studies and ethnographic fieldwork in the cultural and linguistic anthropology fields in order to preserve the memory, history, and traditions of the disappearing and endangered Afro-Asian groups in the Philippines. Thank you for listening.